Hello, everybody. Today I'm joined by my longtime friend, Dr. Caesar Lim. He's an emergency doctor in the Toronto area, a father of two, and co-host of the Capable Dads podcast. Caesar, thank you for joining today to share your time and your story.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to be on your show.
I want to kick things off by jumping right into your podcast. You co-hosted with
Totally.
your friends Stan and Brendan.
Yeah.
Maybe you can share the impetus behind why you guys set out to make a podcast.
Yeah, it was a bit of a journey to kind of get this project underway. The initial idea actually wasn't a podcast. The initial idea that I had a discussion with Brendan and Stan was we wanted to do something, especially after the pandemic. When the pandemic kind of started opening things up, and we could socialize a little bit more. The idea is that we wanted to do something that would allow dads and specifically to be a little bit more social. We felt that there was a lot of isolation among, definitely within the pandemic, but especially among men and fathers, especially just because, with fathers of young kids and all that, sometimes can be quite busy. And then you kind of put your life on hold a little bit for them. And so, in the combination of the pandemic, having young kids and families and all that, um, we all felt that we were all pretty isolated from the social perspective. So the initial idea was to do something that would bring us together, to have something that we can all share together that had common interests and all that. And there was one day that I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, and I was like, you know what? This could be something that we could kind of do. And, the thing that really drew us together, the three of us, was our love for parenting, or the love of fatherhood and all that. And so we thought, why don't we start a podcast talking about our experiences as dads? And the idea of the podcast wasn't meant to be, you know, um, a podcast about experts. We're not, we're by no means expert. We have no specific training in parenting. But it's about our lived experience and what it was like raising young kids in the current modern day, with the technology and in the world post-pandemic and all that. And so sharing those experiences, especially for other fathers out there with young kids, either you know having new kids coming along, or potentially already having gone through this with us, to kind of find ways to relate to each other, and hopefully talk about some of the challenging things about being fathers in the current day.
I totally agree with being able to relate to, as you said, you're not experts, you're just, you know, dads. And I think it's
Exactly.
a lot easier to listen to somebody who is not an expert. They're just like you. There's a little bit more common ground to work with there.
Yeah,
Um,
I fully agree with that. I think, there's a lot of people out there that are experts. And I think for sure, we really appreciate their opinions and what they have to offer. But sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect because, we listen to these experts and we think, wow, if only I could do those things that they recommend, if only I could pull all that off, I'd be such an amazing father. But in real life, like, it's not realistic to put that expectation on yourself to be able to do all those things. And so I think this podcast is really just to talk about the reality of it. Like, despite listening to all these experts, there's only so much we can accomplish in practically.
so the name Capable Dads, where does that come from and what does it mean to your team?
that's a very that's a very interesting question you asked, because this was a bit of a point of controversy among the three of us when we first started, and over time it's kind of grown onto us. So the name actually was, we actually didn't put that much thought into it. It was, when we first decided to get together as the group of three of us, we had to start a WhatsApp group. And it was okay. Well, what we're going to call this group? It's okay. I'm just going to throw a name out there, Capable Dads, just because it's kind of the first thing that came to my mind. And at first, when we first got together and we were talking about it, um, the three of us were like, "Huh, I don't know about this name. Like, I feel a little, self-congratulatory with this name. It's, what does it actually mean?" And when we kind of broke down, we kind of brainstormed it a little bit more, and through the months and the recordings, we're like, you know what, all it really says is that we're doing our job. Being capable, we're just doing our job. We're nothing special. We're not perfect. We make mistakes like everybody else, but we do the best we can and we get the job done. And that's kind of how we've now internalized it and reflected on it. And we want people to think that, being capable doesn't mean that you're perfect. Being capable just means that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing as a father, as a parent, and all that.
So how do you choose which topics you're going to cover in your episodes?
Um, it's a bit of a discussion among the three of us. We kind of, we all put out ideas out there in terms of what, maybe something one of us is going through at that moment, maybe something one of us has experienced in the past. A lot of times it's about things that a lot of us feel uncomfortable talking about. So a lot of the topics that we talk about on the show, in our opinion, are things that a lot of fathers, a lot of men out there have in their head, um, but may not talk about it openly, may not be comfortable bringing it out to the surface. Um, a large part of it is talking about men's mental health and how do we open up as um, as a group to be like, I'm okay talking about what's actually on my mind rather than bottling it all up and letting it brew in there. So a lot of the topics we talk about kind of somehow circle back to that.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of topics talk about what it's like living in the modern day. I think you and I grew up in a world, and a lot of people in our generation grew up in a world that is very different than it is right now. And I think as parents, we only know what it was like when we were kids. So when we try to raise our kids in this current society and current technology, it sometimes can be quite overwhelming. So I think a lot of our topics revolve around that as well. Like talk about how do you raise a kid in the current state of society, and how do you do it without, minimizing by minimizing the trauma for our kids.
In one of your episodes, your co-host Brendan, I think it was,
Mm,
he mentions the personal growth
mm,
that he's enjoyed from being a father.
yeah.
How would you say you've grown since becoming a father? And do you think that's changed since you've started the podcast?
100%. I think the answer is yes to both of those questions. I think being a father, um, I think a lot of people out there say that the way we parent our kids is the way that we wish we were parented when we were young. And so I think since becoming a father, I've really had to dig deep to see what are the decisions I'm making for my kid and why do I make those decisions. And a lot of times it's, when I really look back at it, it's the decisions I make for my kid is a lot of it's guided by the idea that this is how I wished I was raised, or this is how, what I was exposed to when I was a kid. So there was a lot of growth from that perspective. And then the podcast itself, I think the growth there is the connection that I had with the other dads. So the other Brendan and Stan on the show, like it's probably the one time or the first time I actually connected with dads at that level. I think a lot of times, when you go meet up in socially, either in a, meeting up with a bunch of dads in the park or grabbing a beer with somebody, you talk a little superficially. You talk about like, what's your week been like? What's this activity been like for you? How's school for your kids? You talk relatively superficially. But the podcast really allowed us to really dive deep into the challenges, whether it's you know, what was it like when we got into that fight with our kid? How do we navigate that, that conflict with our kid? Um, when our kid came crying to us because they got pushed around in school, how do we deal with that situation? How do we feel about that situation? How do we address it with our kid without getting down a spiral of, anger and negativity and all that? So those kind of discussions I wouldn't generally have with somebody just, at a play date, at the playground. These are really kind of deep discussions. We sit down and really dissect what our brains go through. And so I think the growth there, it's allowing us to process it in real time talking it out with each other, getting each other's opinions. And so I think in that perspective, it helps us grow a lot as parents.
I want to bring it back to what you said about the way we parent our children is how we wanted to be parented ourselves.
Hmm.
We're obviously the role model for our children.
Yeah.
They're watching everything we do. We shape who they become through that. Um, Personally, I find I'm always walking the line between having my children fail
Mm.
and having them learn um, from experience versus my natural instinct, which is to get in there and show them how to do it properly the first time,
Right.
almost to coddle them. I even heard you mention on one of your episodes that you would, what did you say? Let your kids figure themselves out as long as they were safe in doing so.
Yeah.
Maybe can you speak to that a little bit and share, as the father of two, how you've approached that and if it's evolved over time as you've taken the learnings from your first child to the second one?
Yeah, for sure. I think definitely the way we parent one kid is going to be very different than how you parent the second kid, and it's going to be very different how you parent the kids together. To answer your first question of um, letting them make mistakes, letting them fail, I think that's a very challenge. That's probably one of the hardest things as a parent, because as an adult, we've gone through it ourselves. We've made the mistakes ourselves, and I think one of the most common things that parents will say is, "I don't want to have my kid go through the same failures as I have, so therefore I'm going to provide for them." And I think that's sometimes, I mean, there's certain things I think that makes sense for. We wouldn't want our kids to suffer unnecessarily, but at the same time, we can't do everything for them. Otherwise, they're never going to learn. They're going to feel like they always have to depend on their caregiver to, to complete the task for them. They don't know how to troubleshoot. They don't know how to problem solve and all that. So I do think that sometimes allowing them to make calculated mistakes, um, and making sure it's safe for them, obviously, but allowing them to make those mistakes a little bit so they can learn, is one of the most challenging things to do as a parent. Yet at the same time, it's probably one of the most beneficial things that we could do for our kids, is allowing them to learn on their own. Because at some point, they're going to have to step out into the real world and figure themselves out, and you're not going to be around them all the time to help solve their problems, and so they need to learn how to problem solve. The second point that you mentioned was um, letting my kids figure things out between each other. So there was a part of an episode where we talked about what happens when our kids fight. Whether it's verbally, whether it's physically, and they have conflict with each other. Conflict with each other. A lot of times, my kids will look at me. They'll be arguing, and they'll both look at me for my approval or disapproval, for me to side with one kid or the other. And I just look right back at them and say, "You two need to figure this out for yourself." Like, I'm not getting involved with this argument as long as it's like not dangerous, like no one's getting hurt physically, and it hasn't escalated to the point where I do need to intervene. I try to give them a chance to solve their argument, and so it allows them to have that discussion with each other. To be, if one kid wants the toy and the other kid wants the same toy, how are we going to figure this out so it's fair, that everybody kind of gets what they want at the end? And I try my hardest to take a step back as much as I can, to allow them to have that skill to negotiate, to discuss it with each other so that they can come to a consensus, so everybody achieves what they want. And I do think that's probably a good life lesson for the kids.
Um, so when it comes to parenting, it's generally accepted as the responsibility of the parents or people that we, as the parents, entrust with, raising them.
Hmm.
It could be like a grandmother, it could be, um, is it ever okay to parent somebody else's child? In your opinion, this is more of a, it's not meant to be it's more an exploration of the topic, if you will. Is it okay to generally ever parent somebody else's child, and where should that line be drawn? Like, that's used for the sake of argument. Um, Public spaces, like at the
Mm.
playground, versus they're in a private space, like your house.
Yeah, it's a challenging question. I think, the three of us have had that discussion before, and I think we're still not completely it's not completely clear in terms of when we should or should not intervene. I think it's very nuanced. I think it's very case specific. Um, I think for me, a lot of it comes down to the first thing is safety, right? So I think if it's in a public space, in the playground, and a kid that's not mine is in a position of potential harm, and that kid's parent isn't around, and I like if I don't intervene, then something potentially bad could happen and result in you know a kid getting injured, then I think I probably will intervene. So that may be, kid climbing a structure is going to fall off. Maybe I need to be there to catch the kid, before they hit the ground. If it's, a ball running onto the street and a kid wants to run onto the street and there, cars passing by and there's no one else to stop the kid, I'll probably jump in there to stop the kid. And so things like that, I think, are pretty universally accepted by parents. When it comes to behavior, I think that's a little bit more tricky. Um, I think behavior is something that is very subjective. Every parent has their own threshold what's acceptable as a behavior, and so I think for that, I try not to, I try not to intervene too much when it comes to correcting another kid's behavior. If that behavior is affecting me directly or my kid directly, so like
Mhm.
another kid's behavior is, being aggressive towards my kid or being aggressive towards me, and I'm directly getting affected by this behavior, then yeah, I probably will say something. I probably will do something about it. But I think that one's a little bit trickier. Um, so yeah, the idea of parenting another kid is I think a very nuanced situation. If it's in my own house, so that's that. Then it depends. So I think if the other kid's parent is in my house, and there's a behavior that is, is I don't find acceptable in my house, I'll probably approach the parent directly first and be like, hey, in our house, this is, we don't do this in our house, and I don't want our kids to do that either. So if it's possible, can you ask your kid to stop whichever behavior? If it's a drop off play date and it's just me, and there's another kid that's not my kid in our house, and there's a behavior that I want to correct because it's, in my opinion, unacceptable, then I will be the parent because I am the only grown up in the household. There's no other grown up here to help kind of navigate that situation. So I likely will speak up a little bit sooner to correct the behavior. So as you can see, like it's very case
Very,
specific.
very case specific, yeah. But
Yeah.
I think what I'm hearing is, uh, when the parent drops their kid off at say your house,
Right.
there's a bit of an implied consent there that
Right.
I'm going to grant you permission within, I don't know, it's very broad, very hard to narrow down. But if my kid's out of line, you've got the authority to correct that behavior.
Yeah, there's certain things I think it's reasonable to, if you're not sure, and you have the time to make that decision, to contact the parent too. So like if it's like a matter of like, is this kid allowed to eat this kind of food? Is this kid allowed to watch this kind of movie that my kids are watching? And I'm not totally sure. I'll send a quick text to that parent to be like, hey, are you okay if this kid eats this pizza? Are you okay if this kid watches this movie? Because that, you got a few minutes versus if something like this kid is, jumping off the counter head first on the ground. Like, okay, I'll probably have to stop that right now without having to ask for permission.
So you also have an episode called Incapable Dads,
Yes.
where you explore taking accountability for your mistakes.
Yeah.
Um, and you mention on that your biggest fear is losing trust of your child.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk to how fathers can strive to keep that trust?
I can speak to how I can perceive how to maintain that trust. Because I'm going like every other dad out there right now, we're all going through it for the first time ourselves. So
Right.
I can talk to you 20 years from now and let you know if it worked or not. Um, but I think I have my own approach to how I try to maintain trust among my kids. And a lot of it's a mix of, what I experienced as a kid myself and my relationship with my family, and how I witness other people with their own family and discussions of, the family dynamics among different friends. Um, I would say, one of my biggest pillars, is maintaining respect between me and my kid. And it goes both ways. If I want them to respect me, I have to respect them. And if I can demonstrate that I respect them, then I can maintain their trust. I think the second I create a larger power differential, because there's automatically a power differential between me and my kid because I'm the grown up, because, I'm the one that is paying for their food, their clothes, their toys. Like there's automatically the power differential. So regardless of how um, friendly or kind I want to be to my kid, there's an intrinsic power differential between us. So I need to somehow show them that despite that power differential, I still will respect them and I will trust them as long as they show me that they are trustworthy. Um, and then if I trust them, the hope is that they will trust me as well. Because that fear that I mentioned in that episode is, when they get into that adolescent years and they kind of distance themselves naturally. And I think every adolescent naturally will distance themselves from their parents. And I think that makes sense evolutionary, is like for them to become independent, for them to be an adult and all that. They have to be able to distance themselves so they can actually strive and thrive in their life. When they do distance themselves, they still see me as a trusted figure. So when they are struggling, whether it's with school, whether it's with relationships, whether it's a job, money, finances, they still will say, you know what, I trust my dad to come up to him to be like, I'm struggling in school. I'm not doing well in this course, or I'm struggling financially. I can't make ends meet. I'm having a difficult time paying rent. What can I do to help? And having them have that trust in me and come to me is, to me, one of the biggest wins.
I couldn't agree more. That's probably the exact right approach to take.
Yeah.
You were, just to bring it back a little bit to the beginning of the show,
Hmm.
you were framing this is more of a modern dad podcast. Um, and as you mentioned, the world we were raised in looks nothing like the world that our kids are growing up today.
Yeah.
Um, the pervasiveness of technology, social media, influencers, all that stuff. How can we help our children think critically when they don't necessarily have the mental capacity to be able to even be mature enough to process these things? How can we help them think critically?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, because I think every kid's brain will work a little bit differently as they develop. It's all gonna be what they're exposed to, their friends, the community that they grow up in. Um, I think because the idea of how to think critically is, again, very subjective. Because someone who can think critically about academics is one thing. Someone who can think critically about, public safety is a little bit different. The idea of street smarts versus book smart, um, is the approach is going to be a little bit different. When it comes to technology, I think we're all learning as we go right now because things are moving so quickly. With social media, with AI, how connected everybody is right now. It's moving so fast that there's no way we can come up with an approach with each part of technology. So my kids are still young. They're only 7 and 5 right now, and so they haven't really gotten deep into technology just yet. They do know how to navigate, simple things like a tablet and watching certain shows on streaming apps, but for the most part, they're not really exposed to social media. So I think that could be the critical time. The critical time is when they start asking questions about, you know, can I get an Instagram account? Can I get a TikTok account? Can I get a Facebook account? Um, that's, I think, going to be the biggest game changer. And my approach to that is try to delay that as much as possible. I don't have a timeline specifically, but as long as possible, I want to delay that. I don't want to delay technology
Mhm.
because I think that's the practicality is they're going to need technology to function in society. So they'll need to know how to use a tablet. They'll need to know how to use a computer. They'll need to know how to use, a cell phone at a certain point. So I don't want to deny them of that exposure. But what I do want to delay as much as possible is the connection to social media, and that specifically are things that essentially they are communicating and interacting with the entire world, the complete, anonymous person out there, um, and then having them have an algorithm tell them what to be exposed to, rather than either me as a parental figure or them consciously making decision what they want to expose themselves to. Because the second that algorithm in social media starts dictating what they consume, I think that's when it becomes very dangerous because it can just take them down the spiral that can be quite detrimental to their mental health.
Yeah, and like to that point, a lot of age inappropriate content available,
Yeah,
whether it's through either themselves or like older siblings, friends,
yeah,
things like, violence, pornography, drugs, things like that.
yeah,
Every parent has their threshold, especially when it comes to like movies. Like
yeah.
some parents don't like the action movies so much,
Right.
but I'm wondering when should we gauge in when do you think it's time for these conversations to take place? I know that your co-host Stan said something um, which I thought was a fantastic approach. He caught his kid um, doing some engaging in age inappropriate content,
Right.
and he said, "You know what? I'm not ready to have this conversation." Um, and it was essentially just pressing the pause button so he could compose himself. And I thought that was a really good approach.
For
But
sure.
when do you think, what signs point to, okay, I need to have these conversations? And what should be concerned about when having these discussions?
I think timing is tricky because I don't think there is a specific hard cutoff time of when you should or should not have these conversations. I think these conversations are not a single conversation. They span probably over years of having this discussion about one thing. So let's say we're talking about violence and violence in movies, violence in TV shows. When is appropriate to expose your kids to that, or if they have an interest in it? Well, I think it starts off, at a very young age because kids are going to be exposed to violence from the get go. When the second they start going to playground and there's a dispute of who gets this monkey bar versus the other monkey bar, things start escalating, and not say that it goes to violence, but it's conflict. Violence essentially is the a later stage of conflict. And so I think having those discussions early is important to discuss, okay, what do you do in a state of conflict? What do you do when, you disagree with somebody else? How do you approach that situation? And then as, the years go on, they get a little bit older, those discussions become a little bit more complex. You start, having, okay, what would you do in a situation if someone corners you and wants to start a fight? What would you want to do? And, having that discussion with them will then slowly kind of, I think, in my mind, frame what my kid's going to think of when they're put in that situation themselves, so that when they do consume content, I'm okay for them watching things that have violence, that have fighting and all that, as long as they understand that, fighting is not something that is your first step to conflict resolution, and that it's kind of like a last resort if you're really trying to protect yourself and protect your own safety. That is probably when it would be appropriate. So it's kind of discussions like that that span over a long period of time that eventually will hopefully guide them in a direction where when they do consume certain content that they know how to think critically about it and know that even though I'm watching this doesn't mean that it's right. Just because somebody says that this is the way you should do something doesn't mean it's right, because I grew up in a way where this is how I manage the situation, whether it's about conflict resolution, whether it's about sexuality, whether it's about substance use and all that. Like, I have my own values on how to approach that. I definitely think the way Stan approached that in that episode, where you're not always going to be ready to have these discussions. Sometimes you need, that shock feeling when you're unprepared for a situation to happen. You That's probably not the best time for you to react or have that discussion because you're so emotionally charged at that time. But maybe you do need to take a step back and wait 24 hours, sleep on it, let the emotions settle down first before having that discussion with your kid.
So you mentioned at the top of the show, or I should say, I mentioned at the top of the show that you are an emergency doctor.
Yeah.
How has that shaped you as a parent?
Uh, it's interesting because I think it goes both ways. I think by me um, working in emergency medicine, I view the world in a very specific way. Um, a lot of it is risk calculation. So knowing, if it's a matter of an activity for my kid, some sort of sport or some sort of, playground activity, I will do that risk calculation of terms of what I'm going to let my kid do, and what am I going to not let my kid do. So I think me being an emergency physician, I see the world in a very specific lens. At
Hmm.
the same time, me being a father has really changed how I am as an emergency physician as well. I think I've developed a lot more empathy. I've developed a lot more patience, a lot more understanding towards the people I see at work. When I see a troubled person in, their adult life, when it comes to especially things like mental health, I think back, well, where did this person come from? Like, what was his childhood like or her childhood like that resulted in this situation that they're ending up in my department in this circumstance? And so I think being a father gives me a little bit of empathy and understanding that, I'm seeing this person for this 15 minutes at this point in their life. I don't know all that 25, 30, 35 years before this 15 minutes, what happened to them. A lot could have happened to them in those early stages of life that resulted in the situation they're in right now. And I need to be understand towards that. It's a little bit of that whole trauma informed care, where I have to understand that everybody has experienced trauma at some point in their life, and how that trauma manifested and affected that person is gonna result in how I interact with them at work.
So it's a great segue actually into this next question. Just talking about how we were brought up, um, as was the norm at the time. I was raised in a much more traditional, old school gender role.
Yeah.
My mom was the nurturer. My dad was the authority figure.
Right.
Um, I was almost, I don't want to use the word scared, but I didn't want to make him mad because,
Mhm.
just that. Anyways,
Yep.
so and I was also a single parent for a time,
Mhm.
so I had to occupy both roles.
Right.
So I'm curious, how do you and your wife approach these roles, and did your own upbringing impact your own feelings on how to approach those?
Yeah, I would say for me at least, I grew up in not the most conventional way. Not when it comes to gender roles, 'cause I think that still was quite, you know, it was quite traditional in my household. But I went to boarding school relatively early in my childhood. I was in boarding school when I was 10 years old. So it was hard for me to even witness what um, a family structure looked like. Because when I was 10, I was already living away from home, and I was living with a teacher at the school that we went to. So I actually didn't have a whole framework to reflect on when I became a parent in terms of what a family structure should actually look like. A lot of my, what I imagine a family should look like came from either witnessing my friends or what I see in movies or things like that. So, um, a lot of it was kind of like a fabricated structure in my own head. So when it comes to how I decide to what I view myself in my family, my own family, um, it comes down to what I think I should be doing as a father, as a parent, and all that. Not so much what I witness, let's say my father, or what I, you know, uh, what I witness somebody else do. I kind of pick little pieces of my imagination of what a parent should be doing, and that's what I do. So in our family, I feel like there are certain things that I think are still traditional because I think there's certain things that I'm not as good as my wife is. My wife's an amazing cook in the kitchen, so even though I can cook and I can do a lot of the cooking sometimes, I do know that it's not my forte, and I know that my wife's a much better cook than me. So um, there's certain things that someone may view my my family structure be like, oh, you guys are quite traditional, but I don't see it that way. I don't see that you know certain people, the mother in the house has to do a certain thing, the father in the house has to do a certain thing. The way I view it is, whoever's best at it will take control of that situation. So if it ends up being that I'm a better cook, then I will take charge of that. If my wife's a better a care kind of care provider for my kids, then she'll do that. I work in the healthcare business. So, for me, a lot of the care and the tending to the, wounded in my family will likely fall to me because that is my job and that is my expertise. So that is kind of how I view my family structures. Whoever is most capable in that task is probably gonna be the one that's going to take the lead in it.
So this is probably going to be a hard question to answer.
Mm.
How can we know that we're doing a good job raising our kids?
Yeah. That is a nearly impossible question to answer at this time in our life. Um, There's one time actually, I had this discussion with my wife, and I asked her, you know, there are people who are like professional athletes. There are people who are professional, um, you know, musicians. How do you become a professional parent? Like what are the qualifications? What's the the measurement of saying that I'm a professional parent? And she looked at me as like, the only person that can decide that is your kid. And that's the only way I think we'll know whether we did a good job or not. You know, 15, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And how you measure that is going to be what do you value as a person? So if you value quality time spent with a person is a sign of success, then your your outcome of did you do a good job in the future is, does your kid want to spend time with you, right? If your measurement of success is, you know, how much possessions I have, then I suspect maybe the measurement of, did a kid buy you a car, your favorite, your dream car when you're in your retirement, is that a measure of success, kind of thing. So I think the bottom line is we won't know until our kids are fully grown and they're completely independent adults, and they come back to us and we ask them that question, hey, how did I do as a dad? And they're the only ones that can judge us, you know. And I think we all I think everybody judges other people, whether it's subconscious, internally, or you know, um, outright verbally. we all judge other people, but in the end, like, I know people, when people watch our podcast, I know people probably judge us for being like, oh, I would never do that as a parent. That's such a terrible way of, approaching that situation. In my mind, I don't really care what other people think. I don't care how someone else judges me and what I do. All I really care about is what my kids think of me when they grow up. Because everyone could say I'm doing a terrible job, but as long as my kid comes to me like, Dad, I am so grateful for everything you've done for me. I wouldn't have wanted any other person to be my dad. That's the win for me.
That is the absolute win.
Yeah.
So what's in store for season 2 of Capable Dads?
Yeah, we're still brainstorming that right now. So the first season, it was just the three of us, and the discussions that we had, essentially were us kind of thinking about what would be some difficult conversations that we've all thought about that we've never actually talked about. So that was season 1, and a lot of it was trial and error, seeing what worked. There were some episodes that we recorded but didn't publish because we felt like it wasn't exactly how we wanted to land. I think season 2 will try to focus on having more guests on the show with specific, experiences. So the three of us we're all three of us are married. All three of us have, you know, healthy kids, and we're pretty kind of standard when it comes to our families and all that. So I think having people with a little bit more diverse experiences would complement the show quite a bit. How we approach that is going to be a little bit tricky because we do our recordings in person. So if we decide to have guests that are either further away or not as commutable, that we would have to find a way to record a little bit more remotely, which we don't really have a setup for that just yet. So we're still in the kind of the middle of figuring that out.
And where can people find the podcast?
So currently, we release on Spotify and YouTube. So you can just look up The Capable Dads on either Spotify and YouTube, and you'll find us. You can follow us on our Instagram account to see our latest episode releases and some clips from the episode. So that's how people can find us. And we strongly encourage people to give us feedback because, as we mentioned multiple times on the show, we're not experts, and we want to hear what other people want to hear us talking about. And if anybody is interested in sharing their story with us and want to be a guest on our show, we're happy to take people to get them onto the show.
What do you hope people take away from our chat today?
I hope people really see the importance of how we as parents, not just fathers, and any parental figure out there, how important our decisions are for the future of our kid. Parenting is not easy by any means. I think it's probably one of the hardest things to do in life. And every decision we make for our kid will have lasting effects on their future. So even though we think something small, one comment here or there is not a big deal, don't forget it, they're too young to remember, they likely will remember if it lands on them, whether it's positive or negative. So positive experiences will land, and they will remember that. And 20 years, 30 years from now, they'll be like, I remember when my dad said this to me when I was 5, and it just made me feel so happy, and it gave me so much confidence and self-esteem that I remember that moment, and it carried me through all these challenging experiences in the future. At the same time, you can also have that 5-year-old be like, I remember when my dad told me this, and it made me feel so down, and I never forgot it, and it became my narrative, and I never forgot what they said, and it affected them through multiple stages in their life. So I think, you know, just be mindful. There's not one form of parenting that we endorse on our show. It's more so just being mindful parents, and just think a little bit, before any action or thing that you say to your kid, because it's likely going to shape who they are in the future.
So I think what Capable Dads is doing is really helping to normalize dads talking about raising their kids in an open, honest, and vulnerable way.
Yeah,
It's also helping to normalize viewing dads as more active and engaged participants in the parenting role.
yeah,
Unfortunately, we're don't want to generalize here, but still not seen as active as maybe mom. Um, so I just want to thank you for what you're doing. It's gonna have a huge impact on just, as I said, it's so relatable because you guys are not claiming to be experts. So it's just, three dads hanging out and sharing their stories and their pains, their worries, their concerns. It's a fantastic thing that you're doing. I just want to say thank you.
I appreciate that, Dan. I really appreciate having you having me on your show. It's been a great experience.
My pleasure. Well, thank you, Caesar. Um, have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you. You too.